Blood doesn't wash out of Italian silk. That's the first thing Dominic Castellano realized as he knelt on the shattered glass of his foyer, pressing trembling, stained hands against Clara's chest. She was just the nanny, but as she bled out for his children, he realized she was his salvation. No one in the Chicago underworld spoke Dominic Castellano's name above a whisper. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Castellano Syndicate, a man who had inherited a crumbling empire from a careless father and forged it into a titanium stronghold. To the public, he was a venture capitalist with a penchant for high-end real estate. To the streets, he was a reaper in a tailored suit. But inside the high stone walls of his Lake Forest estate, Dominic was something far more exhausting. A single father to grieving 4-year-old twins. Leo and Mia had not been born into a warm home. Their mother, an icy socialite from a rival family, had died in a fiery car wreck 2 years prior, a hit meant for Dominic. Since that day, Leo hadn't spoken a single word, communicating only through frantic tugs on clothing and terrified, wide-eyed stares. Mia, conversely, had become a hurricane of tantrums and defiance, breaking toys and driving away a revolving door of elite, highly trained nannies. The Castellano mansion, despite its sweeping staircases and priceless art, was a tomb of silence and outbursts. Enter Clara Hayes. Clara wasn't polished, she wasn't multilingual, and she certainly didn't have a degree in early childhood development from a Swiss boarding school. She was a 23-year-old nursing school dropout, drowning in a sea of medical debt. Her younger brother, Arthur, had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive leukemia, and the experimental treatments had drained their deceased parents' life insurance within months. Desperation breeds courage. And when Clara saw an anonymous, fiercely lucrative listing for a live-in au pair, requiring strict NDAs and a willingness to undergo extreme background checks, she didn't hesitate. On a bleak Tuesday in November, Clara stood before the wrought iron gates of the Castellano estate, shivering in a thin yellow peacoat that starkly contrasted with the gray, unforgiving stone of the mansion. Inside, Dominic stood in his dark-paneled study, watching the surveillance feed. Beside him, his right-hand man, Matteo Rossi, thumbed through a sleek leather folder containing Clara's entire life history. "She's clean, Dom," Matteo grunted, tapping the file. "Almost painfully clean. No criminal record, stellar grades before she dropped out, volunteers at the pediatric ward on weekends. Her only debt is medical. She's desperate, which means she'll keep her mouth shut for the paycheck. But she's soft. She won't last a week with the twins, let alone the environment." Dominic's cold, steel blue eyes remained fixed on the monitor. He watched as the massive front doors were opened by armed security. Clara flinched at the sight of the holstered weapons but stood her ground, her chin tilted up. "Bring her to the East Wing," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that brokered no argument. "Let's see what the girl in yellow is made of." 10 minutes later, Clara was ushered into the grand playroom. It was a chaotic mess of shattered wooden blocks, torn picture books, and spilled juice. Mia was standing on a velvet ottoman, screaming at the top of her lungs, while Leo was curled into a tight ball in the corner, his hands pressed hard over his ears, trembling violently. 3 maids stood helplessly in the doorway, too afraid of Dominic's wrath to intervene forcefully. Clara didn't look at the maids. She didn't look at the extravagant toys or the security cameras tracking her every move. She immediately dropped to her knees, disregarding her only good pair of slacks, and crawled slowly toward Leo. From the study, Dominic held his breath. He was used to nannies trying to bribe Mia to stop screaming. Instead, Clara ignored the loud child to focus on the quiet one. Clara stopped a few feet from Leo. She didn't reach out to touch him. Instead, she began to hum. It was a low, steady melody, an old Appalachian lullaby her mother used to sing. She took a slow, deep breath in, visibly exaggerating the motion, and let it out. She did it again. After a full minute, Leo peeked through his fingers. He saw this strange woman breathing deeply, and subconsciously, his own hyperventilation began to slow, matching her rhythm. Once Leo's shoulders dropped, Clara gently slid a soft, plush blanket over him, creating a small tent. "It's too loud out here," she whispered softly. You stay in the fort. I'll handle the dragon." Dominic felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He watched as Clara stood up, turned to the screaming Mia, and simply sat down cross-legged on the floor directly in front of the ottoman. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just waited, looking at the little girl with a profound, unyielding patience. 2 minutes later, Mia ran out of breath. The little girl stared down at Clara, confused by the lack of reaction. "Are you done being a dragon?" Clara asked, her voice calm and entirely devoid of judgment. "Because if you are, I was hoping you could help me. I don't know my way around this big castle, and I need a brave knight to show me." Mia blinked, her lower lip trembling. Then, with a sudden, heartbreaking sob, she launched herself off the ottoman and into Clara's arms. Clara caught her effortlessly, holding the crying child against her chest, rocking her back and forth. In the study, Matteo let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Dominic didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen, an unreadable expression settling over his harsh features. He had built an empire on fear and intimidation. He knew how to break people, how to bend them to his will, but he had absolutely no idea how to heal them. Looking at the girl in the yellow coat cradling his broken daughter, Dominic realized he had just invited something far more dangerous than an assassin into his home. He had invited hope. By the second month, the Castellano estate had fundamentally shifted. The heavy, suffocating silence had been replaced by the sound of crayons scratching against paper, the soft melodies of Clara's humming, and occasionally, the muffled, hesitant laughter of Mia. Even Leo had changed. While he still hadn't spoken, he now shadowed Clara's every step, his small hand securely gripping the hem of her skirts. But as Clara brought light into the upper floors of the mansion, the darkness of Dominic's world began to bleed through the cracks. Clara wasn't stupid. The extravagant paycheck was the first clue, but it was the details that painted the true picture. The men who visited in the dead of night, wearing tailored suits that bulged at the shoulders. The way Dominic's eyes were constantly scanning, analyzing, calculating threats. And then there was the night she went down to the kitchen for a glass of warm milk for Leo and found Dominic standing by the marble island, shirtless, while Matteo stitched a long, jagged knife wound on his bicep. Clara had frozen in the doorway, the ceramic mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. Dominic had snapped his head toward her, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock, resting on the counter. When he saw it was only Clara, his posture relaxed, but his eyes grew furious. "You're supposed to be upstairs," he snapped, the venom in his voice, a stark contrast to the quiet man she occasionally saw reading to the twins. Leo couldn't sleep," Clara stammered, her medical training automatically kicking in as she stared at the bloody mess on his arm. "Your sutures are uneven," she blurted out before she could stop herself. Matteo paused, looking offended. Dominic just stared at her, the vein in his jaw ticking. "Excuse me?" Clara swallowed her fear, stepping over the broken mug. "I was in nursing school. He's pulling the thread too tight on the proximal end. It's going to scar badly and limit your range of motion." Without waiting for permission, she walked to the island, took the needle and forceps from a dumbfounded Matteo, and washed her hands at the sink. Dominic watched her, paralyzed by her sheer audacity. As her soft, cool fingers brushed against his hot, blood-slicked skin, a jolt of electricity shot up his arm, completely unrelated to the wound. She worked quickly, her face pale but focused, redoing the stitches with a practiced, gentle precision. "You shouldn't be down here, Clara," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "You shouldn't see these things." "I see a man who needs a better doctor," she replied softly, not meeting his gaze as she tied off the thread. She bandaged his arm, her thumbs lingering just a second too long on his skin before she pulled away. "Whatever you do, Mr. Castellano, please, just keep it away from the children." "I always do," he replied, though looking into her wide, hazel eyes, he felt the lie stick in his throat. The truth was, Dominic was losing control, not just of his heart, but of his city. A brutal, ambitious rival named Silas Moretti had been aggressively encroaching on Castellano territory. Silas was a new breed of criminal, reckless, unprincipled, and eager to make a name for himself by taking down the king. Where Dominic operated with a strict code, no women, no children, no civilian casualties, Silas saw everyone as collateral damage. The tension in the house escalated the following week. Security was tripled. Clara noticed the guards in the garden now carried assault rifles openly. Dominic barely slept, his face drawn and exhausted. He began avoiding the nursery, distancing himself from the twins and from Clara. He thought his distance would protect them. A classic mafia defense mechanism. If I don't love them, my enemies cannot use them against me. But Silas Moretti was already watching. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Dominic was downtown at a secure warehouse, negotiating a truce that he knew was a trap, trying to buy time to smoke out a rat in his organization. Clara was in the mansion's sunroom, painting watercolors with the twins. The heavy rain masked the sound of the perimeter alarms being quietly disabled. The rat in Dominic's crew had given Silas the blind spots in the estate's security grid. Clara was laughing, dabbing a spot of blue paint on Mia's nose, when she noticed the heavy oak doors of the sunroom slowly creak open. She expected to see one of the maids. Instead, she saw a man in a wet leather jacket, water dripping from his dark hair, a suppressed pistol held loosely in his hand. 2 more men stepped in behind him. The air in the room vanished. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. Well, the lead man smirked, his eyes scanning the opulent room before settling on the children. Look what we have here. The Castellano brats. Clara didn't scream. Panic would set the twins off, and noise would draw immediate fire. Her mind, hardened by years of surviving the brutal reality of poverty and her brother's illness, went completely cold and crystalline. Mia, Leo, Clara said, her voice unnervingly steady. We're going to play the quiet game. Hide behind the sofa. Now, the twins, conditioned by Clara's gentle authority, scrambled behind the heavy velvet sofa without a sound. Clara slowly stood up, placing herself directly between the gunmen and the children. She was a tiny, fragile thing in a paint-stained apron. But as she stared down the barrels of their weapons, she felt an ancient, primal protectiveness rise within her. You're in the wrong house, Clara said, her voice steady. The gunman laughed, stepping closer. And you're in the wrong line of work, sweetheart. Step aside. Moretti just wants to send Dominic a little message. We take the boy, and we leave. Leo. They wanted to take Leo. No, Clara said, her voice dropping to a fierce, icy whisper. The man sighed, raising his gun, aiming it dead center at Clara's chest. I wasn't asking. The heavy silence in the sunroom stretched until it felt like a wire about to snap. The lead gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, his cruel smile widening as he prepared to step over Clara's dead body to claim the Castellano heir. But Clara was a survivor. She had spent her entire life fighting poverty, fighting the healthcare system, fighting the despair that threatened to swallow her brother. She was not going to let a street thug in a wet leather jacket take the only light left in this fortress. With a sudden, explosive burst of adrenaline, Clara didn't retreat. She lunged forward. She grabbed the heavy, oak-framed easel holding Mia's wet watercolor and shoved it violently into the gunman's chest. The heavy wood struck his arms, knocking his aim upward just as the gun fired. The suppressed shot sounded like a sharp, violent cough. The bullet shattered the massive glass pane of the skylight above them, raining jagged crystalline shards down upon the Persian rug. Bitch! The man roared, shoving the easel aside. He leveled the gun directly at Clara's face. Behind the sofa, Mia screamed. Clara spun around, throwing her arms out wide, turning her back to the gunman to blanket the children with her own body. She curled over the velvet armrest, her yellow coat acting as a vibrant shield over the trembling twins. Thwip, thwip. 2 more shots rang out. Clara felt a sledgehammer strike her upper back, just beneath her shoulder blade. The force of it knocked the breath from her lungs, driving her hard into the floorboards. A second impact grazed her ribs, tearing through her coat like paper. Searing, white-hot agony flared through her chest, stealing her vision for a terrifying second. She tasted copper. Grab the boy, let's go! The lead gunman barked, stepping over the shattered glass toward Clara's bleeding form. He reached down, grabbing the collar of Clara's coat to rip her away from the children. But before his hand could tighten, the heavy oak doors of the sunroom exploded inward, torn off their hinges by sheer brute force. Dominic Castellano stood in the doorway. He was drenched in rain, his tailored suit clinging to his broad frame, his chest heaving. His steel-blue eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were completely black with a murderous, unholy rage. He hadn't been fooled by Silas Moretti's trap at the warehouse. Matteo had noticed the estate's camera feeds looping on their encrypted servers. They had driven back at 100 miles an hour, but as Dominic saw the blood pooling around Clara's yellow coat, he knew he was seconds too late. The three intruders barely had time to turn. Dominic didn't just shoot them, he eradicated them. His Glock barked in rapid, deafening succession. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, putting 2 bullets into the chest and 1 into the head of each man before they could even raise their weapons. The pristine sunroom was instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse, the smell of cordite and copper suffocating the scent of rain and paint. But Dominic didn't look at the bodies. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, sliding across the blood-slicked floorboards until he reached Clara. "Clara," he choked out, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of the Mafia Don's composure. He grabbed her gently, turning her over. Her face was chalk white, her breath coming in shallow, wet gasps. Blood was spreading rapidly across the front of her blouse, staining the delicate Italian silk of Dominic's shirt as he pulled her against him. "Mr. Castellano," Clara whispered, her eyes fluttering, struggling to focus on his face. "I'm here. I'm right here," Dominic said frantically, pressing both his trembling hands over the gunshot wound on her chest to stem the bleeding. Blood welled up between his fingers, warm and terrifyingly fast. "Matteo, get Dr. Reed. Get him here now." Matteo was already in the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his face pale as he surveyed the carnage in the bleeding girl. "Medevac is 3 minutes out, Dom. We're locking down the estate." Dominic looked down at the woman bleeding out in his arms. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was an innocent. She was the girl who sang Appalachian lullabies and painted with his traumatized daughter. She was supposed to be safe behind his walls. The twins. Clara coughed, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "Are they? They're safe," Dominic vowed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of grief and awe. "Because of you. You saved them, Clara." From behind the sofa, a small, trembling figure emerged. Leo, the 4-year-old boy, who hadn't made a sound in 2 years, walked through the shattered glass on unsteady legs. He dropped to his knees in the pooling blood beside Dominic. He reached out his tiny hand, gently resting it on Clara's pale cheek. Dominic held his breath, watching his son. Leo's lower lip quivered. He looked at Clara's closing eyes, and then, in a voice hoarse from years of disuse, he let out a shattered, desperate sound. "Clara, don't sleep." Clara managed a faint, heartbreaking smile, her hand weakly rising to cover Leo's. Then, her hand went limp, dropping to the floor. Her eyes rolled back, and the sunroom faded into absolute, suffocating darkness. Dominic pulled her lifeless weight against his chest, burying his face in her hair as the distant, rhythmic chopping of a helicopter blade began to vibrate through the walls of the estate. Blood doesn't wash out of Italian silk, and Dominic knew, in that agonizing moment, that Clara Hayes was permanently carved into his soul. The rhythmic, synthetic beep of a heart monitor was the first thing to cut through the heavy fog in Clara's mind. She tried to take a breath, but a sharp, localized agony radiating from her collarbone forced her to stop short. She squeezed her eyes shut, a low groan escaping her dry lips. "Don't move. You tore through muscle, and the bullet fractured your scapula." The voice was rough, exhausted, and unmistakably Dominic's. Clara forced her heavy eyelids open. She was not in a hospital, at least, not a public one. The room was sterile, modern, and windowless, filled with state-of-the-art medical equipment. But the walls were lined with dark mahogany paneling. Sitting in a leather armchair beside her bed was the head of the Castellano syndicate. Dominic looked like he had walked through a war zone. He was in his shirt sleeves, the fabric heavily stained with dried, rusted blood. His tie was gone, his collar unbuttoned, and a dark shadow of stubble covered his jaw. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His blue eyes bloodshot, but violently awake. "The kids!" Clara rasped, her throat feeling like sandpaper. Dominic leaned forward, picking up a plastic cup of ice chips and gently spooning one into her mouth. His touch was incredibly reverent, a stark contrast to the violence she had witnessed him commit. "They are completely unharmed. Sleeping upstairs. Leo hasn't stopped asking for you." Clara closed her eyes in relief, a stray tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank God." Dominic set the cup down. He leaned his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands for a long moment. When he looked up, the raw vulnerability in his expression was devastating. "I have built my entire life around power, Clara. Around the illusion of control. I thought my walls were high enough to keep the monsters out." He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her uninjured hand. "But I let them right into the room with you. You took a bullet meant for my blood. They're my kids too." "Dominic," Clara whispered softly, the first time she had ever used his first name. "I wasn't going to let him hurt them." Dominic's grip tightened on her hand. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a kiss against her skin that felt like a vow. "I know. And I realized something as I watched you bleeding out on my floor. You aren't just my employee, Clara. You are the only good thing left in this godforsaken world. You are an angel who walked into hell to save my family." Before Clara could process the heavy, intoxicating weight of his words, the heavy metal door of the medical suite hissed open. Mateo stepped inside. He glanced at Clara, offering her a rare, genuine smile of relief, before his face hardened as he looked at his boss. "We found the rat, Dom," Mateo said quietly. Dominic didn't let go of Clara's hand, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating apex predator. "Who?" "Paulie." Mateo spat the name with disgust. "The head of the Westgate Security. Moretti bought out his gambling markers in Atlantic City. He gave them the blind spots and disabled the perimeter alarms." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Paulie had always been the one to let her out when she took the twins for walks in the gardens. He had smiled at them just yesterday. "Where is he?" Dominic asked, his voice dead flat. "Tied to a chair in the soundproof basement," Mateo replied. "Waiting for you." Dominic nodded slowly. He stood up, gently placing Clara's hand back on the blanket. "Keep the perimeter locked down. Double the interior guard. I'll be down in 5 minutes." Mateo nodded and slipped out of the room. Clara looked at Dominic, fear, and a strange, twisting sorrow in her chest. She knew what happened in soundproof basements. "Dominic." He paused, looking down at her. He saw the apprehension in her eyes and sighed, the anger softening slightly. "This is the world I live in, Clara. Silas Moretti crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. He tried to murder my children, and he nearly took you from me." Dominic leaned over the bed, his face inches from hers. "I am going to burn his entire empire to the ground. I am going to make sure that no one in this city ever breathes the name Castellano without trembling. But I need you to understand why." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, placing it gently on her lap. "What is this?" Clara asked, wincing as she reached for it. "While you were in surgery, I made some calls," Dominic said softly. "I looked into your brother, Arthur." Clara froze, panic spiking in her chest. "Dominic, please. He has nothing to do with—" "I know," Dominic interrupted gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I know he doesn't, and neither did you. Open it." With trembling fingers, Clara tore open the envelope. Inside was a heavy cardstock document bearing the crest of the Mount Sinai Private Oncology Wing. Attached was a ledger with a staggering number at the bottom. Next to the number, stamped in red ink, was the word "Paid in Full." Below that was a transfer document confirming Arthur Hayes had been relocated to a private, luxury suite under the care of Dr. Eris Beckman, the leading leukemia specialist in the country. Clara stopped breathing. She stared at the paper, the letters swimming as tears flooded her eyes. You paid it? All of it? I bought the hospital wing, Dominic corrected quietly. Arthur has round-the-clock care. The best experimental treatments in the world. He will never lack for anything ever again. And neither will you. A sob ripped from Clara's throat. She reached up with her good arm, grabbing the lapel of his ruined shirt, pulling him down to her. Dominic didn't resist. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his arms wrapping carefully around her waist, avoiding her bandages. You saved my life, Clara cried onto his shoulder, the weight of 100 sleepless, terrifying nights lifting from her soul. No, Piccola, Dominic murmured, his lips pressing against the pulse point on her neck, his voice fierce and possessive. You saved mine. Now, rest. When you wake up, Silas Moretti will be a ghost, and this city will be safe for you. For us. He pulled back, his eyes dropping to her lips. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. The kiss was gentle at first, a test of boundaries, but as Clara kissed him back, pouring all her gratitude and newfound, terrifying love into it, the kiss deepened. It was a promise forged in blood and gunpowder, sealing her fate to the most dangerous man in Chicago. Clara closed her eyes as Dominic pulled away and walked toward the door. She was a nanny who had taken a bullet, but as the heavy steel door clicked shut behind the Mafia Boss, she knew she had just become the untouchable queen of the Castellano Empire. For 3 weeks, the underground medical wing of the Castellano estate was Clara's entire universe. Her physical recovery was brutal, the fractured scapula demanded absolute stillness, and the torn muscle burned with every breath. Yet, ironically, it was the most peaceful period of her life. Dominic transformed into a ghost of the underworld, practically living in the chair beside her bed. He conducted his ruthless syndicate business via encrypted tablets in the hallway, always returning the moment she stirred. The twins, Leo and Mia, were brought down twice a day. Mia would gently place her favorite stuffed animals around Clara's pillows, while Leo, who had begun speaking in soft, hesitant sentences, would read aloud from his picture books, his small hand resting carefully on Clara's uninjured arm. But outside those reinforced steel doors, Chicago was burning. Silas Moretti was a cornered rat. Dominic's retaliation for the sunroom attack had been swift and apocalyptic. Castellano enforcers had dismantled Moretti's operations piece by piece, burning his warehouses, seizing his ports, and liquidating his financial fronts. Silas was bleeding money and manpower, but his sheer desperation made him unimaginably dangerous. The twist came on a freezing Tuesday morning. Clara was sitting up, sipping tea, when Matteo burst into the medical suite. He didn't knock. His face was ashen, his usually immaculate suit rumpled. Dom, we have a massive problem, Matteo said, his eyes darting to Clara before settling on his boss. Dominic stood up slowly, the temperature in the room plummeting. Speak. It's Mount Sinai, Matteo breathed out, the words hitting Clara like a physical blow. Silas's accountant managed to trace the shell corporations you used to buy the oncology wing. Silas knows about Arthur. He knows Arthur is Clara's brother, and he knows exactly what Clara means to you. He just mobilized his last heavy hitters. They're storming the hospital in 10 minutes. He wants an exchange. The brother for the territory. The teacup slipped from Clara's hand, shattering against the floorboards. Hot liquid splashed against her bare ankles, but she didn't feel it. Arthur, she gasped, her heart rate monitor spiking into a frantic, high-pitched rhythm. Dominic. My brother, he has no immune system. He can't. Clara. Look at me, Dominic commanded, his voice slicing through her rising panic. He gripped her shoulders, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. I told you I would protect him. Do you trust me? Yes, she choked out, tears spilling over her eyelashes. Dominic turned to Matteo, a dark, predatory smile curving his lips, a smile that promised absolute ruin. Silas thinks I'm blinded by affection. He thinks I left the boy unguarded to protect the estate. Dominic reached for his suit jacket, slipping it over his broad shoulders. Tell the extraction team at Mount Sinai to drop the veil. Let Silas walk right into the lobby. Clara watched, bewildered, as Matteo's panicked expression melted into a grim, knowing smirk. You knew he would track the money. I laid the breadcrumbs myself, Dominic replied coldly. I needed to draw Silas out of his bunker. He thought he was hunting a weakness. He didn't realize he was walking into an abattoir. Half an hour later, the trap snapped shut. Silas Moretti, flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, breached the gleaming glass doors of the Mount Sinai Private Oncology Wing. They expected terrified nurses and helpless patients. Instead, the doctors at the reception desk produced suppressed submachine guns from beneath the counter. The janitors buffing the floors dropped their machines and flanked the exits. Dominic hadn't just bought the hospital wing to cure Arthur. He had staffed the entire perimeter with his most elite, lethal operatives, disguised in scrubs and white coats.